At the beginning of the 20th century, Iran possessed the second most established tradition of Islamic seminaries in the Muslim world after the Ottoman Empire. Particularly within Shi'ism, the class of ayatollahs had become influential not only in religious life but also in the social and legal spheres. In rural areas, imams and mujtahids functioned as both spiritual guides and local authorities. Yet in the cities, a very different Iran was beginning to take shape. In 1925, Reza Khan founded the Pahlavi dynasty and ascended the throne, launching a series of reforms aimed at transforming Iran into a Western-style nation-state. These reforms, much like French Jacobinism, were top-down and highly centralized. Traditional seminaries were placed under state control, religious endowments were weakened, and the ulama were pushed out of public life. His son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, accelerated these policies, equating Western-style living with modernity. But this modernity did not resonate the same way in the countryside. The reforms were shaped in favor of the urban elite. Land reform was uneven, and economic development was concentrated in central regions. Rural communities were excluded, both economically and culturally, from this transformation. It was at this point that the voices of the ayatollahs grew louder. Religious figures came to represent not only spiritual authority, but also demands for social justice and cultural authenticity. The divide between these two Irans deepened. One was the Iran of the palace, integrated into Western diplomatic circles, synchronized with Washington and London. The other was the Iran of the mosque, the bazaar, and the village square. Two Irans living on the same land, but in entirely different worlds. And so the question emerged, how would these two Irans collide? To answer it, we must first examine the Iran of the Shah, and then the rising wave of resistance that followed. When Mohammad Reza Pahlavi came to power in 1941, after the forced abdication of his father, he was just 22 years old. At first, he appeared to respect the limits of constitutional monarchy, but he quickly narrowed the political space, consolidating his rule into near-absolute authority. Following the CIA-backed coup against Prime Minister Mossadegh in 1953, he emerged as the undisputed decision-maker. Parliament became powerless, opposition was crushed, and the press was silenced. The Shah sought to rapidly turn Iran into a westernized society. In 1963, he launched a sweeping reform program known as the White Revolution. Women were granted suffrage, primary education was expanded, healthcare services were extended to rural areas, and land reforms redistributed property to peasants. On the surface, it was a revolutionary modernization project. Yet the reforms were not just about modernization, they were also acts of social engineering. Although large landowners lost power, a viable rural economy failed to materialize. Peasants struggled to survive on small plots and sank into debt. Legal reforms expanded women's rights, but conservative elements, especially within the clergy, saw these changes as an assault on Islam. Even reforms in education and health were met with suspicion. At the top of these efforts stood the military. At their root lay a fundamental lack of trust. During this time, Iran's oil revenues skyrocketed. By the early 1970s, Iran had become one of OPEC's leading members. It was an era described as the golden age of personal wealth and corruption. Lavish infrastructure projects, massive arms purchases from the West, and investments concentrated in Tehran made Iran the showcase state of the Middle East. But behind the gleaming facade lurked profound inequality. The gap between the upper and lower classes widened. The state centralized the distribution of resources, and discontent simmered among the marginalized. For many, economic growth simply meant watching others become wealthy. The Shah's foreign policy only deepened domestic mistrust. Military and diplomatic relations with the United States were exceptionally close. Covert cooperation with Israel further damaged Iran's legitimacy in the eyes of the Arab world. These alliances fostered a widespread perception, both among neighboring countries and within Iranian society, that the regime was not authentically Iranian, but a foreign-imposed structure. By the mid-20th century, Iran outwardly appeared to embody a successful model of Western-style modernization. But to those inside the country, the regime was a monarchical republic dressed in constitutional veneers. For most Iranians, this system made them neither agents nor beneficiaries, but merely spectators. The year 1963 marked a turning point. The Shah's reform program, branded the White Revolution, did not merely challenge landowners, it directly targeted Iran's oldest and most enduring authority, the religious class. It was at this moment that a relatively unknown cleric from Qom, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, emerged as the first major figure to publicly denounce the regime. In a sermon delivered during the month of Ramadan, Khomeini openly criticized the Pahlavi dynasty, its ties to Israel, and the reforms of the White Revolution. The subsequent wave of protests across the country was violently suppressed by the military. Hundreds were killed. Khomeini was arrested, later released, and then exiled in 1964 for opposing a law that granted American military personnel immunity from Iranian jurisdiction. Exile did not silence him. On the contrary, it elevated him into a symbolic figure of resistance. Around the same time, the regime's primary tool of repression, Savak, the secret police, was expanding its reach. Savak was not just an intelligence agency, it was a machine of fear. Clerics, students, and leftists were surveilled, harassed, detained, and tortured, regardless of their exact affiliations. Critical thought was stifled in universities, and loyalty to the regime became the primary standard for academic survival. Yet repression did not destroy the opposition. It forced it to adapt, diversify, and deepen. By the 1970s, three major lines of resistance had emerged in Iranian society. Islamists, who rejected the Pahlavi regime as illegitimate and called for a government based on Islamic principles. Marxist leftists, who denounced class inequality and called for anti-imperialist revolution, and the urban middle-class youth, particularly students, who demanded freedom, civil rights, and the rule of law. These groups did not share a common vision of the future, but they shared a common enemy: the Shah, his intelligence apparatus, and his alliance with the United States. Though there was little ideological unity among them, the overlap in their opposition laid the groundwork for the regime's eventual collapse. This period was not only one of opposition radicalization, but also regime radicalization. As the Shah's sense of threat increased, so did his aggression. In 1971, the extravagant celebrations of the 2100th anniversary of the Persian Empire became a national embarrassment. While peasants lived on the edge of starvation, the monarchy held feasts on crystal tableware flown in from France. Amid such contradictions, Iran's youth radicalized. Islamist and Marxist groups went underground. Some began to advocate armed resistance. Certain leftist organizations escalated to bank robberies, assassinations, and propaganda operations. It was a time when duplicating Khomeini's sermons was a crime, and listening to foreign radio could land one in prison. Every form of dissent was treated as a threat to the state. Different sectors of society, though motivated by different hopes, began to converge under the shared weight of repression. The religious sought a Sharia-based order, the leftists social justice, the middle class political freedom, and they all understood, within this system, under this regime, there was no room for any of it. That growing silence, fragmented, diverse, and simmering, was about to break into the streets. At the beginning of 1978, what seemed like a minor journalistic episode would ignite a nationwide uprising and alter the course of Iran's history. An article published in Etelat, a pro-government newspaper, included disparaging remarks about Ayatollah Khomeini. The piece provoked widespread outrage in the city of Qom. Students and clerics poured into the streets. The police intervened, and many protesters were killed. This incident is widely seen as the spark of the revolution, the first time mass opposition to the regime involved the kind of sacrifice that would produce martyrs. The unrest quickly spread to other cities: Tehran, Tabriz, Mashhad, Isfahan. Everywhere, demonstrations intensified. Funeral processions turned into fresh protests. The regime responded with escalating violence, but the more blood the Shah's forces spilled, the larger and more determined the crowds became. Each crackdown further eroded the regime's already fragile moral legitimacy. By the autumn of 1978, the state's control mechanisms had largely collapsed. In November, a wave of nationwide strikes, especially among oil workers, brought the economy to a standstill. Transportation systems halted, government bureaucracy was paralyzed. The working class was no longer a passive observer, but an active driver of the revolutionary process. This was not merely a middle-class urban revolt, but the political expression of a multi-layered social breakdown. Meanwhile, fractures within the palace were becoming visible. The Shah consulted military commanders and the US Embassy, searching for a solution. Temporary cabinets were formed in an effort to appease the opposition, but it was too late. The public was no longer demanding reform or a change in leadership. They wanted the entire regime dismantled. In January 1979, the Shah quietly fled the country. It was not exile, it was collapse. His departure created a sense of triumph among the people, but it did not yet produce a coherent political alternative. That alternative soon emerged. On February 1, 1979, after 15 years in exile, Ayatollah Khomeini returned from Paris. Millions turned out not merely to greet a religious scholar, but to welcome the leader of a revolution. This was not a homecoming, it was a march to power. In the weeks that followed, the military fractured. Some units defected and joined the people. The remaining state institutions unraveled. Palaces were abandoned. Savak, the secret police, disintegrated. By mid-February, the monarchy was officially abolished. In its place emerged a new regime, still vague in form but clear in spirit, the Islamic Republic of Iran. At this stage, the revolution was more than a transfer of power. It was a revolution of legitimacy. A monarchy that had lasted for 2,500 years ended, not by legal decree, but by popular action. And yet, one fundamental question remained unanswered. What class, what ideology, what vision of the future would define the new order? A revolution had been won, but this was only the beginning. The 1979 revolution was not merely a regime change in Iran's history, it was a profound shift in political legitimacy. A people ruled by monarchy for centuries took to the streets, claiming the right to shape their own destiny. And eventually they succeeded in dismantling the old order. But what exactly did this revolution change? What did it gain, and what was lost? Perhaps its most prominent claim was to free Iran from Western imperialism and foreign dependency. The US-backed military and economic infrastructure of the Shah's era was largely dismantled. The oil industry was nationalized. Foreign policy pivoted toward Islamic solidarity and anti-imperialist rhetoric. For many among the lower and middle classes, this produced a surge of national self-confidence. A significant portion of Iranians believed they had finally built a system rooted in their own religious and cultural values, capable of resisting the West. Another major shift was the construction of national unity through religion. Under Ayatollah Khomeini's leadership, Shia Islam was no longer just a faith, it became the ideological foundation of the state. This transformation created a new kind of political legitimacy. The clerical class now held not only moral, but also executive and judicial authority. The revolution had politicized the religious identity of the masses. But these gains came at heavy cost. There were serious rollbacks in women's rights. Many of the advances women had made under the Shah were reversed. Mandatory veiling laws were introduced. Family law was rewritten. Women's visibility in public life was severely restricted. Their social role became increasingly defined as moral symbols, not political agents. Even more significantly, political pluralism was eliminated. The diverse opposition that had existed in the early months of 1979 was quickly suppressed. Leftists, liberals, ethnic movements, and even competing interpretations within Islam were pushed out or destroyed. What followed was not the continuation of revolution, but a counter-revolution, a new authoritarian regime, now grounded in religious legitimacy, emerged. One of the pillars of this new order was the formation of the Revolutionary Guards. This force was not only a military institution, it functioned as a political police and ideological enforcer. Tasked with defending the spirit of the revolution, it expanded its powers with vague but powerful justifications. Executions, arrests, and censorship became part of the new normal. And before the revolution could even consolidate itself, Iran found itself at war. In 1980, Iraq under Saddam Hussein launched an invasion. What followed was an 8-year war of attrition. The economy was shattered. Hundreds of thousands died, and the revolution's energy was consumed on the battlefield. In the end, the revolution gave Iran independence and identity, but at the cost of freedom, pluralism, and social peace. In the immediate aftermath of the 1979 revolution, Iran found itself internationally isolated. The US Embassy hostage crisis severed what remained of the country's ties with the West. This event marked not just a diplomatic rupture, but also a turning point in Iran's anti-imperialist identity. The pro-Western policies of the Pahlavi era were abandoned in favor of a narrative of Over time, that loneliness transformed into political isolationism, economic stagnation, and growing domestic discontent. Today's protests are driven not only by material grievances, but also by a long-standing absence of political representation. The younger generation, especially those born after 1990, do not carry the hopes of 1979. They do not view the Islamic Republic as the product of their struggle, nor as the bearer of their aspirations. Contemporary Iran operates on a different foundation than that of 1979. Back then, people were demanding something. Today, many are seeking freedom from something. From women's resistance to compulsory veiling, to student protests, to workers' strikes, one question recurs. Is Iran still living out the revolution of 1979, or is it now awaiting its own counter-revolution? Mounting repression at home, endless sanctions abroad, and shifting regional dynamics have left Iran looking besieged from all sides. The Islamic Republic now faces perhaps one of the weakest moments in its history. And in today's Iran, one question echoes louder than ever. Is a second revolution possible? The answer, once again, may come from the street.